Hey YouTube, my name is Justin and this is my entrance into the 2023 Gatton CNC Christmas Challenge. This is a one-of-a-kind epoxy poured Christmas tree project that I designed myself, and the best part is there's built-in lights in the back that makes the individual lights light up. Let me show you how I made it. First and foremost, I apologize for the format of this video. I wasn't actually intending on making this into a long-form content, hence why it's filmed like it's going to be a short-form video. Anyway, here I am cutting down a large 1.5-inch thick panel that I purchased from Lowe's, and I purchased this panel specifically to fit some lights that I already had on hand. If I'm being honest, I would probably use a different style of light if I were to make this project again, but since I already had them, I wanted to try to incorporate them. You'll notice that the battery pack is somewhat thick, which is why I needed a thicker piece of pine to install them into. My goal from the start was to make a custom cover for the back that would be recessed into the sign and cover up the battery pack when it was all finished. Luckily, I was able to accomplish this, but let me show you how I got there. Once I finished cutting down that panel into 4 equal parts so I could maybe make more than one of these, I brought those dimensions into Canva and started to design the layout. If you haven't heard of this design program and you have a CNC machine, I highly recommend that you check it out. It's extremely easy to use, and if you pay for the Pro version, which is about $12 a month, you're able to export your designs as SVG files. This is great for a CNC user because now I can edit that SVG file and assign toolpaths for my machine to Carve. In order to better understand the toolpaths that I assigned for this project, I think it's easier just to show you. The most important thing to note here before I start carving my first section is that I have a fence on my CNC machine, which you will see in the lower left-hand corner, that guarantees that every time I put this wood on the machine, it's in the exact same location. Because that makes my X and Y points constant, all I need to do is probe for my Z height. And once that's done, I can start carving my first pocket. This first section will be filled with black epoxy and is carved at 0.15 inch depth using a 1/4 inch and 1/8 inch downcut bit. I ended up carving to this depth in 2 passes, but you could do it in 1 if you wanted to be a little bit more aggressive. Once it's off the machine and before I start pouring epoxy, I want to make sure that I seal the grain since this is just pine. My preferred method to do that is to use a few thick coats of spray lacquer. Once that's dry, I can start mixing my epoxy according to the directions on the container. This is Total Boat tabletop epoxy, so it's a 1-to-1 mix, and all I need to do to add color is add some black pigment powder. After thoroughly mixing the epoxy and making sure that my work surface is level, I pour the epoxy into the pocket, making sure that it overflows the surface. I then come back with a torch, making sure to pop the bubbles. I did this a few times within the first 10 minutes, and then I let it sit overnight to cure. After a few days, I put it back on the machine and got ready to start carving the next pocket. And like I mentioned earlier, the fence makes it easy to line up, and all I need to do is probe for the Z height. This pocket is carved at the same depth as the black was, but in addition to using the same bits as I did before, I also used a 1/16 inch downcut bit to get a little bit more detail. And with that finished, it's almost starting to look like a Christmas tree. Following the same procedures that we did during the first pour, I mixed up a new batch of epoxy, but this time I colored it green. And just like we did while pouring the black, we want to make sure that this green epoxy overflows the top of the workpiece. And once that's fully cured, we can move on to carving the parts of this project that will eventually light up. Now this section is carved using pockets with the same exact bits that we used before, but instead of carving at 0.15 inch depth, we carve a little bit deeper at 0.35 inch. I do have to note that I changed my mind halfway through this project and decided not to make this title text light up, so I could have carved this particular part a little bit more shallow and only carved deeper on the actual Christmas tree bulbs. The reason that the bulbs need to be carved deeper is because when we pocket out the back of this project later on, we only want to target those specific areas. And with that carve complete, we can move on to our final pour of epoxy. This is where we add multiple different colors to try to make our project look like our original design. I decided to use the same colors that the original image has, but you could really mix and match as you want. And like the other two epoxy pours that we did before this one, make sure that your epoxy overflows the pockets. After filling in all the bulbs, the last thing we need to do is fill in our title text with some red epoxy. And the final result, guess what? Looks nothing like a Christmas tree. In order to fix that, I'm going to put this back on the machine, install a 1-inch surfacing bit, and flatten the top at 0.01 inch depth. This is the point in the project where the whole thing starts to come together. If you wanted to, you could stop the project here, sand everything to your desired grit, and finish it with some lacquer and call it a day. But because we wanted to add lights, we need to keep going. So the plan from here is to put this sign back on the machine and pocket out the areas directly behind the light bulbs. In order to do that, I'm going to flip the image upside down and put it on the machine so I can start carving. This toolpath is going to accomplish a few things. First, it's going to pocket out a recessed area for a back cover. Then it's going to pocket out the areas for the light bulbs, the battery pack, and also leave room for some wire. At the top of the sign, you'll also notice that I carved out a keyhole. If I zoom in to where the battery pack goes, you'll notice that there's a small slot underneath, and that's just for some additional wire, since the wire is actually coming out on the same side as the switch, which will be accessible from the outside of the sign. This toolpath is pretty straightforward and only requires the 1/4-inch downcut bit, as well as a keyhole bit for the top keyhole. And once it's finished, you'll notice that the epoxy from the star and the light bulbs is shining through to the other side. Now that all the carving is done, we can start prepping this for final assembly. Before we add in the lights, I sanded this up to my desired grit, which was 220 grit sandpaper. Then I added a nice edge to this using my router table. And one last thing I decided to try before adding a final coat of lacquer over the top of this was I made a mixture of white paint primer as well as water and covered the top surface before removing it in an attempt to whitewash the top. This didn't work as well as I intended, but it did remove some of the yellow color from the pine. And the final step to finish the top surface was to add a few clear coats of semi-gloss spray lacquer. Now that the main panel of the project is finished, we can start adding in the lights. The plan is to fish the wire through the intended slots that we already carved and add 2 of these small fairy lights into each hole. Once those are in place, I'm going to add this custom cover over the top, which I had already carved on the machine using a panel of 0.2 inch thick wood. Adding the lights took a little bit longer than I intended because these small fairy lights get tangled up pretty easily. In order to help combat that, I used the assistance of some blue painter's tape and held them in place after I inserted the lights into each hole. But once they were finally in place, I secured the cover to the back by countersinking screw holes and drilling it into place. And once that's done, we can finally see the end result. Alright, well this project is finished up and I think it came out pretty good. I like how it looks and I think it's pretty unique from what I've seen so far. Next time, if I were to do this again, I might use different lights, but they ended up working out in the end. If you're interested in building this yourself, like I mentioned earlier in the beginning, there are build plans available for purchase down in the video description. Not only will you get the SVG files that are associated with this file, but also there's a PDF build manual that will go over everything you need to know, materials, toolpaths, CNC bits, and all that jazz, so that any skill level could build this project. Now that I'm finished up with this, I'm gonna go give it away to someone as a gift and go build something new. See you next time.